Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Political Economy of Forbes 15. My name is Niklas Hintermeyer. I'm a journalist of the German-speaking issue of Forbes, and I'm very pleased to welcome my guest today. It's Arturo Sarukhan. He served 22 years as a career diplomat for the Foreign Service for Mexico. Between 2007 and 2013, he was the Mexican ambassador to the United States. Amongst other things, he's also founder and president of the Sarukhan+Associates strategic consultancy firm in Washington, D.C. So Ambassador Sarukhan, thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
So you were, as I said before, Mexican ambassador to the United States, served as the longest ambassador. You were also like the youngest one. So could you highlight some events, also some challenges between this period of 2007 and 2013?
Well, Nicholas, certainly if you compare it to what's going on today in the relationship between Mexico and the United States and with President Trump, looking back, those would seem to be the golden days of the US-Mexico bilateral relationship. Because regardless of whether you had a Republican or a Democratic administration, and I served during the last 2 years of the Bush administration and then the first full 4 years of the first term of the Obama administration, regardless of whether you had a Republican or a Democratic administration, there was a sense of strategic traction in the bilateral relationship. It's a very complex relationship, probably one of the most complex bilateral relationships on the face of the earth. I've always said that US-Mexico relations are not for beginners because of how interconnected these two countries are, how the relationship impacts the daily well-being, livelihood, prosperity, security of Americans and Mexicans alike. And it's also a very, if you think of it in terms of power, it's a very asymmetrical relationship. Mexico may be the 13th largest economy in the world, but it's certainly no superpower or no global power. But despite all of this, those years you saw a relationship that matured and that grew and that had a sense of strategic projection and traction because you had presidents in the United States that committed political and diplomatic capital to the relationship. So it doesn't mean that everything was peachy and rosy, particularly because of how asymmetric this relationship is. And in the history of bilateral relations, contemporary Mexican-US relations, you've always had moments of tension and of conflict and of very complex moments in both directions. But those were certainly golden years, I think, in terms of what was achieved and the strategic vision. Just think that in 1985, for example, Mexico and the United States had faced the nadir of their relationship in the modern era, and it was the result of an external factor and a bilateral factor. The external factor was that, if you remember, in the early mid-80s, Mexico and the United States clashed openly over policy towards Central America. Mexico decided that Central America was its foremost priority in terms of foreign policy. We're in the midst of the second Cold War, when Reagan doubles down in pushing back against what he saw was communist Soviet footprint in the Americas, starting in Central America. And Mexico and the United States clashed over these policies. And then in the midst of that, a DEA agent was kidnapped and killed on Mexican soil, Enrique Camarena. And so the relationship plummeted. But soon thereafter, first because of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and what that did to the economic connectivity between Mexico and the United States. And then, paradoxically, another external event, 9/11, and how that changes the way Mexico and the United States work together on security-related issues. The relationship changes immensely. And it isn't really until 2016 with Trump as the winner of the US presidential election that the relationship again starts losing momentum, and in fact has almost lost the wheels on several occasions if it had not been for yeoman's work of career and government officials on both sides of the border trying to insulate the relationship from being used as a political electoral piñata by Donald Trump. I think that if your question is, do I have a special memory from those years, and especially what's going on these days in the United States, the tragic events of the assassination of George Floyd and this very important social movement that is now capturing the political bandwidth of the United States, Black Lives Matter. I don't think there was a more poignant moment in my service as Mexican ambassador to the United States than that frigid morning that I sat behind President Obama on the stands that were erected on Capitol Hill in Congress when he was sworn in as the first Black president of the United States, and to look out on the mall and see those 2 million people that were out there in the freezing temperatures. It was a historical moment that I will forever cherish.
We'll also talk later a little bit about the Mexican-American relation nowadays, but I also want to cover a little bit another topic. In 2009, you introduced Twitter as a first ambassador, as a political public diplomacy tool, like a digital diplomacy tool. As a first question, why did you decide to use Twitter as a tool, and how do you think did digital diplomacy develop since then, also seen against the background of the coronavirus crisis? Because I assume that many ambassador meetings or travelings could have not taken place like in recent months.
Yeah, I thought one of the challenges that I felt at the time when I decided to open a Twitter account as a means of conducting public diplomacy and engaging with audiences was that whereas the muscle tone in the US-Mexican relationship was extremely strong, public perceptions on both sides of the border as to what we were doing and why we were doing things was not in sync with what the formal diplomatic relationship looked like. And so we needed to, in many ways, break the cycle of the media, of traditional media, basically doing two things. If you remember, Mexico in 2009 was starting to see this huge spike in violence triggered by transnational organized crime operating in Mexico. And so there was this narrative about Mexico that was only about drugs and thugs and violence. And I at the time, I felt that for most of the media, if it didn't bleed, it wouldn't lead. That is the stories that were coming out on Mexico were solely driven by the stories about violence. And the other thing is that in many ways, complex issues tend to be impacted by the tabloid premises of simplify and exaggerate. And so we thought that using a tool like this to directly convey my points of view and communicate with people who were interested in the US-Mexico relationship was important. And we thought Twitter was the perfect tool to do this. And one of the things that, as usually this happens, once you've started, you have to adapt and tweak. And one of the things that happened relatively early on is obviously I started tweeting in English because I was the ambassador to the United States, and I start getting pushback from Mexicans in Mexico saying, "Why the hell are you tweeting in English?" And my obvious reaction was, "Well, because I'm the Mexican ambassador to the United States." But then immediately, sort of, the question was, well, what about if we started tweeting in both languages, bilingual tweets? Because we very quickly understood that this way we could communicate back to Mexico what we were doing in the United States in the relationship, but also B, given that we have 35 million Mexican Americans living in the United States, 11 million of which are Mexicans, this was also a very powerful tool to engage with them in the United States. So what I started doing was start tweeting in both languages. Some I would replicate in both, some I would do just in Spanish, some I would do in English. I think it is a very powerful tool. I think that just like French was the lingua franca of diplomacy in the 19th century and English has been the lingua franca of diplomacy in the 20th century, Twitter is the lingua franca of diplomacy in the 21st century. I think that any foreign minister, any ambassador, any embassy, any foreign ministry that does not have a Twitter account is making a big mistake. Even if you don't say too much, it's a very powerful listening tool to gauge the temperature of what's going on and how are people reacting and what are different voices in society saying. And especially if you're an ambassador and you can build a good platform of tweets that you follow, it is an unrivaled source of open intelligence. And so I think that is still very important today. I think that the impact of COVID makes these platforms even more relevant because of the physical distancing measures that have been enforced in most countries, because of the impact that it is having on a number of international fora. You've seen, Nicholas, that the 75th UN General Assembly has been postponed. And so a lot of imagination will have to be built into how do you maintain the inner workings of, for example, a multilateral organization without it completely stopping. And you know, these social media tools and these digital platforms will play, I think, a very important role for diplomacy and international affairs going forward.
Let's talk about the United States and its handling with the current coronavirus pandemic. When we look at the economic data, like real GDP shrank by 5% like in the first quarter of this year. Unemployment is still at about 13.3%. So, and as one of the responses to this pandemic, this CARES Act with over $2 trillion was introduced by the US government to help workers, employees, businesses, and families. How do you reflect, like on an economic level, but also like on a political level, the response of the United States towards this pandemic?
I think it has been woefully inadequate, and I think it has been the governors and the mayors, and in certain ways Congress, that have been leading. I think obviously Donald Trump is not responsible for the coronavirus pandemic, but he is certainly responsible for the very inadequate response of the United States, especially in those initial phases when he was still going about that this was a conspiracy by the media and by the Democratic Party to impact his re-election perspectives. So what you've seen, I think, unfortunately, a lot of it is the proverbial a little, too late. And the other thing that I'm worried about is that many of these stimulus tools that are being approved could end up deepening, widening the social and economic inequality that has become a salient factor in the US, and which in many ways explains why we have Donald Trump in the White House today, in the aftermath of the 2009 global recession. So I think that the fact that you've got 40 million plus Americans who filed for unemployment benefits, the fact that now the US has lost more Americans than all the American servicemen and servicewomen who have died in all wars that the United States has participated in its history, with the exception of the Second World War and the Civil War, the economic and social dislocation effects of the pandemic and of the tools that have been applied to confront and to mitigate this, I think, are inadequate. And we may, even though there's been some good news in the May employment numbers, and that you see some activity picking up, and the sort of significant sectors of the American economy have started firing up their machines again and picking up economic activity. We could be in for a long, dislocating and very painful ride in the United States, measured in terms of the economy and, more importantly, of the social dislocation impact that this is having across big regions of the United States, and impacting most socio-demographic groups in the country.
Let's talk about the foreign relations of the United States, because there were also like increasing tensions with China, with US President Donald Trump accusing China to tried to cover up the outbreak of the pandemic, and the Chinese foreign minister then responded that Donald Trump shouldn't lie and accuse China, the country. Also with Europe, there are increasing tensions, with some experts saying that the already existing tensions are increasing. When we look at, for example, Donald Trump recently announced that he would like to reduce the number of US troops in Germany because Germany isn't paying enough money, to put it simple, in the NATO budget, and isn't up to the 2% of GDP target of NATO, under NATO provisions. How do you see the foreign relations with China on the one hand and with Europe on the other in the upcoming month and in the future?
No one should be surprised, Nicholas. If people recall, in his only foreign policy speech during his campaign as the GOP nominee, a speech that he gave here in Washington during the campaign trail in, I think it was June of 2016, Donald Trump promised one thing in his foreign policy speech. He said that he would make the United States a less predictable nation in the world, and that's what he's been doing. In his relationship with NATO allies and with the European Union, it's been happening since day one. The decision regarding troops, level troops in Germany, is not surprising, given that he has continued to badger the European Union with how much they spend on defense. He has a point. I think some European Union countries have been freeloading on the alliance. But what you're seeing is precisely it's an America First driven policy, which is triggering a lot of these positions, especially regarding to the United States. It's a xenophobic, nativist foreign policy, in the sense that, you know, whether it's Mexico and Mexican rapists and bad hombres coming across the border, impacting U.S. public security, the wall. Whether it's China and the name calling with China, the trade war, his mercantilist visions of international trade. Obviously, this tit for tat that has been occurring with the pandemic is extremely concerning. Absolutely, China, I think, has been less than transparent in what happened in those early moments of the pandemic, and needs to be called out and needs to be asked to be accountable and explain and help explain, because the only way we're going to get an adequate handle on how we sort of turn the corner on COVID and how we can better prepare for the next pandemic, and how can we help to diminish the public health and epidemiological effects of COVID are with a clear understanding of how the virus mutated and came out. But this back and forth that we've seen is very unproductive. It's having a profound impact on global supply chains, which is another reason why I'm pessimistic as to what will happen to the economy, not only of the United States, but the global economy, because of the breakdown of these global supply chains and joint production platforms. And the most troubling aspect, obviously, is the vacuum in US leadership in underpinning and building a rules-based international system. It hasn't always been perfect. It has not always been pretty, but the United States has played in the post-war years and in the post-Cold War years a very important role in building this rules-based international system, whether on human rights or trade or commerce or even issues like disarmament, where President Trump is undermining the edifice that was built in the aftermath of the Cold War. So it is very troubling to see the vacuum that is being created by Donald Trump's foreign policy. And I think that's one of the reasons why you've seen so many Republicans, forget about Democrats, who have been extremely critical of President Trump's foreign policy and national defense policy over the past 2.5 years.
How do you reflect like the current Mexican-American relations? Because you mentioned, of course, the wall. Donald Trump said he wants to build a wall next to the Mexican border, towards the Mexican border. There were also controversies on talks, I think in last year, about possible import tariffs from Mexico. But like on the other hand, President López Obrador, the Mexican president, said he would like to meet Donald Trump. I think he initially said it a few months ago, and should also have taken place a Washington summit towards the 1st of July introduction, so to say, of the new trade agreement between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. But this has to be postponed, or it has to take place via telephone. Let's see. So what's your current perspective of view on United States relations with Mexico?
Thank God that meeting was postponed, Nicholas. I think it would have been a suicidal trip by Mexican President López Obrador to come to Washington, D.C. Weeks before the conventions. Trump is only interested in one thing, which is using López Obrador as a prop in his campaign. And I think it would be a grave mistake by Mexico, particularly what is going on socially in the United States today, to come and validate President Trump's presidency by awarding him with a visit to Washington, D.C., even if it's to sort of celebrate the entry into force of the revamped North American Free Trade Agreement, now the USMCA. The relationship is going through a very bad moment. It's probably the worst moment in the relationship since the mid-1980s, which I described to you at the beginning of our conversation. President Trump has used Mexico as a political electoral piñata and has been pimping Mexico with his hardcore voting base. Remember his 3 signature narratives in 2016 were NAFTA is the worst trade agreement ever negotiated by the United States, building a wall because of the security challenges emanating from Mexico towards the United States, and then his dog whistle politics regarding immigration and immigrants and refugees, characterizing them as a threat to the well-being and the security and the prosperity of the United States. And all of these 3 issues are obviously incredibly important for Mexico. The fact that this Mexican government bent the knee, kowtowed to President Trump's unilateral threats of imposing punitive tariffs if Mexico didn't do something to stop the Central American transmigration caravans moving through our country on their way to the United States, just gave Trump the perfect tool to continue to pile pressure on Mexico, because President López Obrador blinked. And Mexico should have not blinked, because we were talking about joint supply chains and production platforms. One of the things that NAFTA has done in 20 plus years is that the US no longer exports US products, Mexico no longer exports Mexican products, and Canada no longer exports Canadian products. We're exporting North American products. Why? Because out of every dollar of exports of Mexico to the United States, 40 cents, 0.40, 40 cents are of US inputs. And out of every dollar that Canada exports to the United States, 28 cents are of US inputs. So what this means is that if you're building a car, that car on average goes back and forth across the Mexico-US border on average 9 times before it hits the sales room. And what this means is that if Donald Trump is going to impose 5, 10, 15, 20% tariffs on Mexican exports, he's also going to slap those tariffs on 40 cents of US inputs. So that's why I was one of those who said Mexico should not blink. We should do jujitsu with President Trump's tariffs, because it will be US businesses and US consumers that will, the moment these tariffs start biting, say, hey, you're causing us significant economic pain by imposing those tariffs because of how interconnected our supply chains. Unfortunately, the Mexican government blinked, and this has given President Trump a very clear understanding of how he can continue to impose his Sinatra doctrine of my way or the highway approach to relations with Mexico. And I fear that if he gets reelected, this dynamic will only deepen and will only worsen what is a very, very complex moment in the recent history of U.S.-Mexican relations.
Because now is the last question, because we unfortunately we're running out of time, but you mentioned like supply chain. Now, when we look on a global scale, there are many talks about a post-COVID-19 world, with globalization pretty much in question, with this intertwined supply chains. Also, there are talks in the European Union, or like in Europe, about a relocalization of very necessary production sectors like medical, healthcare, etc., etc. So what do you think, like on a broader scale, what will be different in a post-COVID-19 world? Can be globalization, can be use of technologies.
Yeah, this as you look at the literature of everything that has been written about COVID since the pandemic broke out, you see recurrent references to COVID-19 as a black swan, but it's anything but a black swan. This is a gray rhino. This is an issue that we all knew was there, like climate change. It's there, the signs are apparent, the threats are apparent, and nobody does anything about it until it's too late. And this is what has happened with COVID. And so certainly several thoughts. I think, for starters, one of the main cleavages going forward in the international system will be between governments and nations that responded efficiently and governments and nations that did not respond efficiently, regardless of whether they're liberal democracies or authoritarian regimes. That will be, I think, a very important cleavage going forward as countries look at the lessons learned from how the international community and specific countries have responded to the crisis. Second, you're absolutely right. There's the whole debate about deglobalization and nearshoring and localization of critical supply chains. Here, I would say Mexico is in a privileged position if the United States, Canada, and Mexico understand the opportunities that this entails in precisely deepening those supply chains and really creating a North American economic powerhouse, as many look to relocate operations from China, either because of the ongoing trade war between the United States and China, or because of some of the effects of the virus and some of the fears that has triggered for foreign investment footprints there. I think you will see a very troubling trend, particularly for someone like me who comes from a country like Mexico that has that has the largest diaspora community any country has in the United States. And that I myself am the son and grandson of refugees on both sides of my families, which is the impact that all of this will have on policies regarding refugees and migrants. I do fear that we will see a creeping process of erecting barriers to the movement of people, whether it's refugees or temporary workers, and this could have some very troubling effects, particularly in countries where immigration has already been politically used and politically charged in an us versus them type of narrative. So these are some of the things that I worry about. Obviously, anyone who says that they have looked into the crystal ball and knows what will be happening in the near term or in the medium term in terms of the effects and the aftermath of COVID is probably smoking too much of some of the illicit substances that we try to keep off the streets these days.
Okay, Ambassador Sarukhan, thank you very much for the interview, and I hope we can repeat it in the upcoming time, and I wish you all the best to Washington, D.C.
Likewise, all the best, Nicholas.
Thank you. And to our viewers, thank you very much for watching our interview, and please subscribe our channel. It's below the YouTube channel, you can subscribe it there, and please join us the next time at Political Economy of Forbes 15. Thank you very much.